We live in a very funny world where it's impossible to meet anybody who is against freedom. You don't have people getting up on platforms saying, I hate freedom. You don't find very many people saying, oh, I really hate free speech. That doesn't really happen. Even the North Koreans love freedom. And in their constitution, they declare free speech is a very important value for us. So we have to be a little careful and understand what is really going on, because there seems to be a kind of a rhetorical reality. The word is very clear, everybody is for free speech. But when push comes to shove, a lot of politicians, a lot of governments seem to have forgotten what they've signed up for. And one of the things that I've learned over the years is that typically when people say they believe in free speech, when you listen carefully, what they are really saying is, I believe in free speech, but. And it's what comes after the but that is really important. Because the minute they use the word but, they basically qualify the term, I believe in free speech. What they really mean is, I believe in free speech, but not for people like you, not for people like them, not for people who are using hate speech, not for people who are using offensive speech, not for people who are a little bit too conservative, not for people who are really, are real believers in sovereignty, not for people who take this very hateful view that in the world we live in, there are only two biological sexes and there aren't a million genders. Those things I do not believe should be said. And I thought that was very, very interesting when I was negotiating with the head of the first venue where we got canceled from, a lovely guy, very nice person. I knew what was going to happen, unlike my two other colleagues who are not as old as I am. They're very naive and they believe the best in people all the time. I knew straight away that when the guy said, I believe in free speech, but that we're not going to get that place. Because what comes after the but is really what they really mean. And the rhetoric comes from before the but. And that's really what we're up against, because we live in a world where a lot of people morally assume that it's good enough to say, I believe in free speech. They don't have to bear the consequences then of negating it later on. And that's an important lesson, I think, that we need to really grasp and understand. What I find very interesting is that our political opponents openly, publicly, casually declare their hatred for free speech. And they're using a language and they're using a word which barely masquerades that. So let me give you an example of this. This morning in Politicos, which is a fairly legitimate Main Street paper, has its good days and its bad days. They have a headline today and it says, Europe's hard right. I like the word hard right. It sounds like something out of a good musical evening out, the hard right. Right, I'll take it, sort of. Europe's hard right bags a big win after own goal by Brussels mayors. And it's the Belgian Liberal MEP, Guy I can never pronounce it, Verhofstadt, who I really dislike from the Brexit days, because
we dislike him longer.
because he used to go through a hard time over Brexit in Britain. And he says, Guy, I don't know if you know what he looks like, this kind of bon vivant, champagne, liberal, champagne socialist. What?
Soft left.
Soft left, yes. He actually uses the term ridiculous own goal. Now, pause on this, because a lot of you might think, well, that's good, an own goal is really, really good. But when he says it's a ridiculous own goal, what he really means is that the problem was not that we were shut down. The problem was not that we were cancelled. The problem was not that they tried to prevent us from finding our voice. The problem was that we overplayed our hand. That's what he's really getting at. The real problem was that we were too transparent. We were too obvious in our attempt to censor our political opponents. If we had been a little bit more subtle like Guy, who's much better at manipulating the way that things operate, maybe it wouldn't be so obvious. If we had found an easier and a better way, maybe if we had, for example, declared that there's a public health problem in the venue, that there were too many rats, or maybe there was some kind of a virus lurking in the background, and for health reasons we closed down. Maybe that would have been better, and that wouldn't have been an own goal. So basically, what I find really interesting and important to reflect on is he has got no problems. He has no problems whatsoever in shutting down his political opponents. That's cool, that's all right. All that he's worried about is that the electorate, the people, the citizens should not really see that. And that was, to me, the main and most important lesson of this, because it tells me that if you have a political establishment in Belgium and in many, many parts of Europe around here, then they're going to try it again and again and again. Now, as a Hungarian, I've got a particular interest in this. I have to admit that, it's my own personal, because I know that with the Hungarian presidency coming up, this was a trial run. This was the first attempt to try to sabotage the legitimacy and the authority of that presidency. If they can violate our freedom to speak out properly, if they get away with that now, then that emboldens them and makes them feel more confident about doing very similar things week after week, month after month, until we get to the end of the year. So for me, this was a very important event, a very important development, and I'm really delighted that, maybe I remember when I heard the news that the courts ruled in our favor, finally, I looked up in the sky and I said, maybe there is a God. So maybe I should attend religious services a little bit more often than I do. I think that that was a really important win from that point of view, but we have to remember that the fight is only just beginning, because I'm totally convinced that they're going to find different ways, different sneaky ways of trying to put a quarantine around people like us who are speaking out, who've got strong views that are challenging to their point of view. They are political cowards. They are really political cowards that instead of engaging with our argument, send in the police. They think that's the answer. The way you deal with arguments you don't like is you send in the police. That is really out of the playbook of a 1930s tin pot dictatorship. That's how you deal with dissidents at every stage. Historically, and in more recent times, the way that freedom is suppressed in the West, the way they do it all the time, is through what I call, and this is not my idea, this is the idea of the first important political philosopher in the English world, but also in the European world, that's Thomas Hobbes. He's the father of liberalism. He's also an incredibly interesting thinker, and he basically argued that in exchange for providing people with security, people will be subservient to anything that the rulers ask them to do. So people give up their freedom in exchange for security. And that exchange, it's what we call a freedom-security exchange. It's something that you saw time and time again. You saw that during COVID, where basically said, as long as you protect us from COVID, you're not allowed to say anything, you're not allowed to make any criticism. We saw something that happening in California, where it really began in the most recent period, where every time a group of conservatives try to have a meeting in a university. The administration says, we'll do a risk assessment, and if it's too risky, you cannot have the meeting. So the way they shut down meetings is by saying that it's not safe. It's safety as the main argument for taking away freedom. And I think that freedom-security exchange or trade-off that we're seeing is what's really at work here. The minute you argue that freedom can be exchanged for security, what you're arguing is that freedom is a second-order principle. What you're saying is that security is so important, safety is so important, avoiding risk is so important, that freedom can be negotiated away. Now just think about it, just pause about it, because that is historically the argument that every dictatorship has used in the last 200 years. In the modern era, every single dictatorship has used this argument for justifying its authoritarian behavior. So that's one thing that we have to remember. The second thing you have to remember, and as a Hungarian, maybe I feel particularly angry about this, is that the rule of law is actually an important concept. We need to have the rule of law in any civilized society. We need to have a situation where the legal institutions are separate from the political institutions. But in any case, we need the law to protect us from a variety of different threats to our existence. Now, people in Brussels, the leadership of the European Union, continually criticizes Hungary and other Central European countries for violating the rule of law. Right? They give us little kind of lectures, you know. It reminds me of the colonial days when the colonial masters said, oh, you little Hungarians, you know, you're new to freedom, you don't really understand it. Why don't you abide by the rule of law? And even though in every respect Hungary possesses a rigorous system of legal norms and rule of law, we still get criticized for that. Now, if you want to see a violation of the rule of law, well, you saw that the last 3 or 4 days. Because basically, in Brussels, what the rule of law actually means is that the political establishment can make up the rules as it goes along. I mean, that's a fantastically important thing. They can make up the rules as they're going along. And they can always pull in a few judges into the whole mix altogether. We were just lucky that for some reason, the third judge, maybe he had a pang of conscience, you know, maybe he was angry at his wife, maybe he felt frustrated. For some reason, he decided that actually the law should be upheld. You know, we shouldn't be making it up as we're going along. So it seems to me that what we have in Brussels is a continuous violation of legal norms, not just of legal norms, but of a foundational value, which is that of freedom, and specifically, ultimately, an attempt to take away our rights as citizens. Because if we cannot open our voice, if we cannot be free to say what we believe in, we are no longer citizens. We are what in English we call subjects. A subject is not the same thing as a citizen. Subjects have got minimal legal rights to express themselves, to influence the way that the world works. So there's an important lesson in here. And for us at MCC Brussels, it's really quite important that we wage a campaign on this at all levels. We've got to wage an intellectual campaign that exposes the hypocrisy of the people that argue, I believe in freedom, but we've got to really expose those kinds of arguments. And secondly, we've got to fight a political battle, and that I leave to my local politician friends and parties, because they know the scene much better than we do, about ensuring that the basic norms of democratic decision-making and of freedom are actually observed. We cannot rely, and this is the important lesson for me, we cannot rely upon one judge who happens to decide in our favor. Because if the future of democracy, if the future of freedom depends on one single individual, then freedom is in trouble. Thank you.